The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal fields of Kepler 442b. Elder Zixth walked slowly through the growing towers, her translucent blue skin catching the light like water. Her four eyes moved independently, watching the young Vidians tend to their crops with gentle songs that helped the plants grow taller and stronger. For 3,000 years, her people had lived in peace on this world. They knew nothing of war, nothing of violence. The worst conflict in their history had been a disagreement about which musical frequency worked best for the harvest. Even that had been settled with a friendly competition that lasted only one season. But today was different. The world felt wrong. Zixth's skin flickered from its usual calming shades of blue to the pale white of distress. She stopped and turned her eyes skyward, as if expecting to see something. The crystal towers hummed softly in the breeze, creating a melody that made her heart's beat in harmony. She was old, even by Vidian standards, and had seen many seasons come and go, but she had never seen a morning like this. Elder, a younger Vidian named Vellandon called, his voice filled with nervous energy. He approached quickly, his skin flickering between blue and pale white, signs of fear that the crystal fields couldn't hide. "Elder, the Sky Watchers, they've seen something." Zixth turned all four of her eyes toward him, narrowing them as she processed his words. "Show me." They walked together to the observation tower at the center of their city, a towering structure made of the same shimmering crystal that pulsed with soft light. Inside, 3 Vidians stood around a glowing device that showed images of space around their world. What Zixth saw made her skin turn completely white with shock. Ships, hundreds of them, black and covered with weapons, swarmed toward Kepler 442b like a colony of angry insects. The vessels were ugly, built only for destruction. Nothing like the smooth, living ships the Vidians used for their rare travels to other worlds. "How long do we have?" Zixth asked, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the heavy weight of a truth that had never before threatened her peaceful world. 2 days, replied Sexmira, the lead Sky Watcher. Maybe less. Zixth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her people's future pressing down on her. In all their long history, they had never faced anything like this. Their ships were designed for exploration and trade, not fighting. Their technology could heal and create, but it could not destroy. The ships in the images belonged to a species they had only heard of in old stories, the hegemony. A group of 3 alien races that traveled from world to world, taking whatever they wanted, and enslaving or killing anyone who dared resist. "Call the council," Zixth said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "All of them." Within an hour, every Vidian leader had gathered in the great chamber beneath the crystal towers. The room filled with worried songs and the flash of pale skin as fear spread like wildfire through the group. Council Prime Vellandon, a middle-aged Vidian with wise silver markings on his face, stood at the center. "We have all seen the images," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "The hegemony comes for our world. They want our crystal technology and our people as slaves." A murmur of concern rippled through the council members. "We must decide what to do," Vellandon continued. "We could try to hide, perhaps move our people into the deep caves." "The hegemony has sensors that can find us anywhere," another council member interjected. "There is nowhere to hide from them." "Then we surrender," said a third. "Give them what they want and hope they leave us alive." "The stories say they take everything," Vellandon said sadly. "They strip worlds bare and leave nothing behind but dust and bones." The council argued for hours, but every idea led to the same conclusion. The Vidians had no weapons, no warships, no way to fight back against the hegemony. They were like children facing wild beasts, helpless and afraid. As the debate raged on, Zixth stood and walked to the great transmitter at the edge of the chamber. This device had only been used for peaceful contact with other species, sharing their music and their knowledge of growing things. Now she would use it for something else. "What are you doing?" asked Vellandon. "What we should have done from the beginning," Zixth replied, "asking for help." She activated the transmitter and began to speak. Her voice, though filled with sadness and fear, also carried hope. The message went out across space, traveling faster than light to reach every corner of the galaxy. "This is Elder Zixth of the Vidian people on Kepler 442b, she began. "We are a peaceful species facing destruction. A force called the hegemony comes to enslave our world and kill our children. We have never known war, never built weapons, never harmed another living being. We cannot defend ourselves against what is coming." She paused, feeling the weight of her words. Around her, the council members had gone silent, listening to their elder make a plea that would echo across the stars. "We call upon any compassionate beings in the galaxy to help us," Zixth continued. "Send us protectors, guardians, angels of mercy to defend the innocent. We offer everything we have to anyone who will stand between us and those who would destroy us. Please, if there is goodness left in this universe, do not let our people die alone." The message repeated itself automatically, broadcasting every hour on all known frequencies. Then there was nothing to do but wait and hope that someone, somewhere, would hear their cry for help and choose to answer it. As Zixth looked out at the gathering storm in the sky, she thought of the stars. A voice, an unknown voice, had reached them, and now it was time to see if the galaxy would listen. But far across the galaxy, a very different kind of being was listening, and the response was already in motion. Kepler 442b's sun set low on the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the crystalline fields. The sky was darkening, and Zixth felt a deep sense of foreboding settle over her. It had been days since the distress call had gone out, but there was no reply. The oppressive silence around them felt heavier with each passing hour. Inside the council chamber, the Vidians were beginning to lose hope. Even the most optimistic among them began to murmur that perhaps no one would answer their call. The hegemony ships continued their approach, their menacing forms now visible from the observation tower. With each passing moment, the ground vibrated slightly from the distant rumbles of the enemy fleet, drawing the Vidians' attention to the fate that was quickly approaching. Zix stood before the council, her 4 eyes reflecting the fear in the room. It was rare for any Vidian to feel fear in their hearts, but these were different times. This was a threat unlike anything they had ever known. Then, as if the stars themselves had heard their plea, a new message came through on the crystal transmitter. "Incoming message from the human fleet," the communications officer announced, his voice shaking slightly. The chamber fell silent, and every Vidian in the room turned toward the glowing panel, the voice of hope sounding as clear as the morning sun. Zixth approached, her heart pounding in anticipation. Was this the answer they had hoped for, or would it be another empty response? The message came through clearly. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the UES Retribution. We've received your distress signal. We are en route to your location with all possible speed. Stay strong. Help is on the way." Zixth blinked in disbelief. Human? These strange beings, who were they? She had never heard of a species like them. Their ships, as she now understood, were unlike the peaceful ships of the Vidians. They were massive and powerful, capable of war and combat. But this message, this promise of help, was like nothing Zixth had ever expected. "Stay strong. What kind of help can they provide?" Council Prime Valendon asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Zixth turned to face him, her eyes filled with cautious optimism. "We have no choice but to trust them." The human fleet. Far from Kepler 442b, Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the UES Retribution, a ship that had seen more than its fair share of battles. The hum of the engines vibrated beneath his boots, a comforting sound that reminded him of his years in the Colonial Defense Force. At 45, Morrison was a seasoned veteran of countless skirmishes, but this was different. There was no other human in the galaxy who could ignore the tone of desperation in that alien voice. "We're 10 hours out from Kepler 442b, Captain," Lieutenant Betty Adams, his communications officer, reported as she looked over the data feed on her console. "If we push the engines, we'll be there in 7. "Push it," Morrison replied, his voice calm but resolute. The ship was built for speed, but even so, it was a long haul to a distant part of the galaxy. He knew that time was of the essence. If they didn't reach the Vidians soon, they might be too late. "Captain," Adams called, a flicker of concern in her voice. "The distress call came from a species we have no record of. The translation software is working overtime to make sense of their language, but—" "I'm aware," Morrison interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the galaxy map displayed in front of him. "We'll make do. Once we arrive, we'll be ready to fight if that's what it takes." As he spoke, the vast emptiness of space stretched out before them. The stars seemed almost distant now, as though they were as unfamiliar to him as the message they had received. A call for help. A species caught in the crossfire of forces far beyond their control. He had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer, but something about this plea, Something about those strange, musical words bothered him deeply. The Vidians' hesitation. Back on Kepler 442b, the mood among the Vidians had shifted from hope to caution. While the message from the humans had sparked a glimmer of hope, there was still skepticism. Zix stood by the observation tower once again, her 4 eyes scanning the horizon. The enemy fleet was still visible, growing ever closer. The ships of the hegemony seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, as if preparing for battle. What kind of beings would come to our aid? Vellenden asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zix thought for a moment. They are not like us, she said softly, her eyes fixed on the approaching fleet. But perhaps that is what we need. The Vidians had no soldiers, no weapons, no military force of any kind. They had always relied on their peaceful existence, living in harmony with nature and with each other. To be faced with such a deadly foe was a reality they had never considered. But now, with the humans on their way, they would have to adapt, and they would have to trust. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared in the sky. It wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was a ship. A massive ship, moving faster than anything the Vidians had ever seen. It was the Retribution, and it was the first sign that their prayers might be answered. But before Zix could say anything, the sky erupted in fire. The hegemony had made their move. The first volley of enemy fire lit up the sky, a terrifying wave of destruction raining down on the crystal towers below. The Vidians were helpless, scattered, and outmatched. Zix's heart raced in fear. Was it too late? Would these mysterious human demons be able to save them in time? The sound of explosions echoed across the crystal fields of Kepler 442b. The air itself seemed to tremble as the first barrage from the hegemony ships ripped into the surface. Zix felt the ground beneath her feet shake, the once peaceful world now under siege. The Vidian Council chamber, constructed from the finest crystal, groaned under the pressure, sending a cascade of dust into the air. "Elder, we must move," Vellenden shouted, his face now pale with terror. He grabbed Zix's arm, urging her to retreat to safety. But Zix stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the sky. The ships were descending, their dark forms blocking out the light. The hegemony had arrived. "Stay calm," Zix said, her voice steady but filled with a sorrowful understanding. "We must hold on a little longer." The message from the humans had promised help, but Zix couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Could they really be here in time? Was this galaxy so cruel that it had only sent demons, beings of war, when they needed angels of peace? The hegemony's second wave of fire came quickly, crashing into the surface with terrifying force. The sky above them split open with the sound of thunder. The Vidians scattered, their once orderly society now thrown into disarray. People screamed, running for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The crystal towers that had stood for millennia began to crumble, the beauty of their design overshadowed by the brutality of the assault. The battle begins. Above the planet, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching the devastating explosions erupt on the surface of Kepler 442b. His crew was tense, every person aware of the mission at hand. They weren't just here for a rescue, they were here to fight. "Captain, the enemy ships are closing in," Lieutenant Adams called out from the comms console. "They're heavily armed and they outnumber us." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he scanned the battle map. The hegemony fleet was imposing, over 200 ships, many of them larger than the Retribution. But Morrison knew one thing: size and numbers didn't matter if you didn't fight smart. "We have one shot at this," Morrison said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "We hit them fast and hit them hard. All ships prepare for evasive maneuvers, target their lead vessels and take out their weapons first." Adams nodded, tapping commands into her console. "Aye, Captain. The Vengeance and Hellhound are in position, awaiting orders." Morrison turned to the tactical officer, Lieutenant Gary Brooks. "Brooks, get me a line to Colonel Cross." Within seconds, the image of Colonel Nathan Cross flickered onto the screen. Cross was a towering figure, his face scarred from years of battle. His cold gray eyes bore the weight of 1,000 wars, but now there was something else, something more personal. "Morrison," Cross said with a nod, "we've got your 6 ready to engage." "Good, let's make sure these bastards know what happens when they pick the wrong fight," Morrison replied, his voice full of grim determination. He wasn't just leading a mission now, he was leading a war. The humans were here to fight, and they would make sure Kepler 442b wasn't destroyed on their watch. The hegemony's wrath. On the surface of Kepler 442b, the Vidians were in a state of panic. The hegemony's ships rained destruction down upon the cities, turning the once vibrant landscapes into smoldering ruins. Elder Zix led a group of survivors into the crystal caverns beneath the city, trying to keep as many safe as possible. The caves were their last refuge, but Zix knew that they wouldn't remain safe for long. The hegemony had no mercy. "We cannot survive much longer like this," Vellenden said, his voice tight with fear. He glanced back at Zix, who was still staring at the sky. "Elder, we need a plan. If these demons can fight like this, we need to be ready for what comes next." Zix turned to him, her 4 eyes filled with resolve. "The humans are coming. We must trust them." But as the vibrations from the distant explosions grew stronger, Zix's certainty began to waver. What if the humans couldn't save them? What if they had come too late? The human response. The Retribution moved with the grace of a predator, darting between asteroids and using the planet's gravity to slingshot into the path of the hegemony's lead vessel. The 3 human ships, Retribution, Vengeance, and Hellhound, had all been specially equipped for combat, their weapon systems humming with lethal energy. Morrison gripped the edge of his command chair as the tactical display came alive with data. The hegemony ships were moving in tight formation, but their speed was no match for the agility of the human fleet. "On my mark," Morrison said, "fire everything." The Retribution's cannons fired first, unleashing a barrage of plasma bolts that lit up the darkness of space. The Vengeance and Hellhound followed suit, striking the enemy ships from all angles. The hegemony was caught off guard, their weapons firing wildly as the human ships danced around them like shadows. "Direct hit on their lead ship," Brooks called out, a note of surprise in his voice. "Their shields are down." Morrison's lips curled into a grim smile. "Good, keep it up." But the hegemony wasn't finished yet. More ships appeared from the void, overwhelming the human fleet's numbers. Morrison knew this wasn't going to be easy. The hegemony had the advantage in sheer force. But humanity had something far more dangerous than numbers: ingenuity. Back on the surface, Zix and the survivors watched the skies above. The hegemony's ships were still bombing the planet, but something had changed. The explosions became erratic, the sound of battle rising to a crescendo. For the first time in days, Zix felt a flicker of hope. And then she heard it, the sound of gunfire, human gunfire. The human forces had arrived, and they were not here to negotiate. Zix's voice quivered slightly as she spoke. "They are here, the demons are here to save us." But would they be in time to stop the hegemony from claiming Kepler 442b? The human fleet moved like a storm, a deadly force of precision and strategy. In the vastness of space, their ships seemed like little more than sparks against the dark backdrop of the galaxy. But those sparks were burning with the fury of a species that had learned to survive against impossible odds. On the bridge of the Retribution, Captain Jake Morrison watched the unfolding battle with grim satisfaction. The hegemony's lead ship was struggling to maintain its shields, and the remaining vessels were beginning to lose their cohesion as human firepower ripped through their defenses. "Keep pressing the attack," Morrison ordered, his voice calm and controlled. "Their formations are falling apart. If we can isolate their flagships, we can break their morale." "Understood, Captain," Lieutenant Adams responded, her fingers flying across her console as she relayed the commands to the fleet. "All ships, target the remaining flagships. Take them out one by one." The Vengeance and Hellhound flanked the Retribution, weaving through the chaos of the hegemony's ships, launching relentless barrages. The enemy fleet was losing its tactical advantage. The humans were faster, smarter, and relentless. "Direct hit on the flagship," Lieutenant Brooks called out. "Their engines are offline. They're disabled, Captain." Morrison nodded, watching the enemy ship falter. "Good, one down, keep the pressure on. They'll be desperate now." On the ground, humanity's first steps. While the space battle raged above, the human Marines were already descending to Kepler 442b's surface. Dropships cut through the atmosphere, their engines roaring as they streaked toward the cities below. The Vidians, still in hiding in the crystal caverns, could do little but listen to the echoes of battle above. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Rodriguez stood at the helm of the first wave of soldiers, her squad of Marines ready for anything. The mission was clear: secure the planet, protect the Vidians, and eliminate the hegemony forces. But as the dropship plummeted toward the ground, a thought gnawed at Rodriguez's mind. The Vidians were peaceful, kind, and had no concept of war. Could they truly work with humans, beings that had built their survival on violence and sacrifice? The dropship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere, turbulence rattling the cabin. The Marines were used to it, though, and they prepared their weapons, checking their gear one last time. "We hit fast, we hit hard, and we don't give them a second to regroup," Rodriguez briefed her team as they neared the landing zone. "These people are counting on us. Don't let them down." With a loud screech, the dropship's door flew open and the Marines leaped out, rushing to the surface. The Vidian capital city was burning. The once beautiful crystal towers were now shattered remnants, their glowing lights flickering weakly in the smoke-filled sky. The ground trembled underfoot, and the distant sound of hegemony gunfire echoed through the air. Rodriguez moved swiftly, signaling her team to fan out. The Marines were trained to work in perfect unison, moving as one as they cleared the city block by block, using the terrain to their advantage. "We have civilians in this sector," one of the Marines reported through his comms. "They're taking cover inside a collapsed building, requesting immediate extraction." "On it," Rodriguez replied. "Secure the perimeter, we'll get them out." She led the team through the ruins, moving cautiously but with purpose. They had a mission to complete, but every moment felt like an eternity. The hegemony was everywhere, and with every passing second the Vidians were at greater risk. The hegemony strikes back. Back in space, the tide had truly begun to turn in favor of the humans. The hegemony's ships, once powerful and confident, were now in disarray. The retribution danced around the enemy's ships, its precision strikes systematically disabling one vessel after another. But the hegemony wasn't done yet. A final, desperate move was coming. On the flagship of the hegemony, Warmaster Keithvar stood at the tactical display, his claws gripping the metal console as he observed the chaos unfolding. His once proud fleet was being obliterated. The humans, those demons from Earth, were proving to be far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "They're like ghosts," his intelligence officer muttered in disbelief. "Every time we think we have them cornered, they slip away and strike again." Keithvar's eyes glowed with frustration. "They're playing with us. Let's see how they handle this." He turned to his communications officer. "Signal the ground forces. We'll show them what happens when they play with the hegemony." He slammed his fist onto the table. "Activate the planetary bombardment." The hegemony, last desperate measure. The Vidians had no defense against the hegemony's destructive power. On the surface of Kepler 442b, Elder Zix stood with her people, watching the destruction from within the crystal caverns. The distant explosions were unmistakable. The hegemony was preparing to wipe them out, just as they had done to countless other civilizations before. Zix's heart sank. They had fought so hard to survive, and now it seemed like their existence would be erased in an instant. The humans had arrived, yes, but could they save them? Could anyone stop the hegemony's annihilation? The human response, a desperate gamble. On the bridge of the retribution, Morrison watched the tactical display with a hard, calculating gaze. The enemy fleet was down to its last few ships, but the hegemony was not going to surrender easily. "Captain," Lieutenant Adams called, her voice tense. "The hegemony has initiated planetary bombardment. They're targeting Vidian cities." Morrison clenched his jaw. "Not on my watch." He turned to his weapons officer. "Brooks, fire on their bombardment ships. Target their engines. If they think they can destroy this world, they're sorely mistaken." "On it, Captain," Brooks responded, his fingers flying over his console. The Retribution launched a barrage of plasma bolts, its weapons scorching the space between them and the hegemony's bombardment ships. The blasts hit their marks, and one by one the hegemony vessels faltered. But the clock was ticking. There wasn't much time before the next wave of bombardment would strike. "Captain," Adams called again, her voice frantic. "There's too many of them. We can't stop them all in time." Morrison's mind raced. He had to think fast. This battle wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. With the hegemony's bombardment ships still active, and the Marines on the ground fighting tooth and nail to save the Vidians, Morrison faced a choice. Continue the space battle, or make a dangerous move that could save the planet but risk everything in the process. Could humanity's resolve withstand the sheer brutality of the hegemony's wrath? The space battle above Kepler 442b raged with intensity, as Morrison and his fleet closed in on the final remnants of the hegemony's attack force. But even as the enemy's ships began to crumble, the real danger lay on the surface below, where the planet's fate was teetering on the edge of oblivion. Zixt watched from the depths of the crystal caverns as the ground trembled once more. The sound of distant explosions, closer now, reached her ears. They were nearing the last of the Vidian cities. The once beautiful landscape was being reduced to rubble by the hegemony's relentless bombardment. Every second counted. Elder, Vellenden said, his voice desperate. We have to do something. We can't wait for the humans forever. They can't stop the hegemony from destroying us all. Zixt closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. She had never imagined her people would be caught in such a violent struggle. For centuries, the Vidians had prided themselves on their peaceful ways, an existence free from war and strife. But now, the very thing they feared most had come to pass. Do not lose faith, she said, her voice calm but heavy with sorrow. The humans are coming. I believe they will not let us fall. Yet even as she spoke, a part of her wondered if they would be too late. The human gamble. On the bridge of the Retribution, Captain Morrison stood rigid, staring at the tactical display as the last of the hegemony ships fell into disarray. The enemy fleet was broken, but the planet below was still in danger. The bombardment ships had been destroyed, but the hegemony had already made their move. Cities were burning, and thousands of innocent lives were at risk. Morrison turned to his tactical officer, Lieutenant Brooks, his voice filled with steely resolve. Brooks, is there any way to intercept the final wave of bombardment? Sir, we can't reach the remaining bombardment ships in time with conventional weapons, Brooks replied, his voice filled with the gravity of the situation. Their shields are too strong. We could try to disable them with a well-placed shot, but we'd need to risk getting close. That puts us within range of their ground-based artillery. Morrison's eyes flickered over the data, his mind racing. We don't have a choice. We're going in. Captain, you can't be serious, Adams exclaimed from her station. If we get too close, we'll be caught in their firing range. It's too risky. Morrison's voice was calm, but his gaze was unwavering. We came here to protect them. We're not leaving until that's done. Adams, send a message to Colonel Cross. We need everything the ground forces can provide. If we're going in close, we need backup. Adams nodded. Aye, Captain, sending now. The decision was made. They would go in, head first into the heart of the storm. The Retribution would take the risk, bearing down on the enemy's bombardment ships and the hegemony's ground forces in a last-ditch effort to save the planet. A desperate rescue. On the surface, the human Marines were engaged in combat, securing the remaining Vidian civilians and trying to hold the hegemony forces back. The soldiers moved through the ruined city streets, their weapons raised, pushing forward despite the overwhelming odds. The hegemony was relentless, and the Marines were fighting a war on two fronts, defending the Vidians and fighting the enemy that wanted to crush them all. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Rodriguez was at the heart of the battle, her voice cutting through the chaos. Move, 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 she shouted, guiding her squad through the crumbling streets. Get those civilians to safety. We don't leave anyone behind. The hegemony's soldiers were well equipped, but the humans had something the enemy didn't: adaptability. Marines moved with terrifying precision, launching coordinated strikes, taking cover in the rubble, and cutting down the enemy with lethal efficiency. But even as they advanced, the sounds of explosions from the sky and the ground grew louder. Rodriguez's radio crackled with a familiar voice. Colonel, we've got a problem, said Major Rick Davis, his voice tight. The hegemony's forces are setting up a secondary bombardment site. If we don't stop them, this whole sector's gone. Rodriguez gritted her teeth. On our way, hold them off, I'll deal with it. Her team pushed through the burning streets, the heat of the flames on their faces as they neared the secondary target. They could hear the enemy troops moving ahead of them, their weapons charging in the distance. Rodriguez's heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed it down. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for a future. Let's show them what happens when you mess with humanity, Rodriguez muttered, a grim smile playing across her lips. The final push. The Retribution and its accompanying ships cut through space, closing the distance to the last of the hegemony's bombardment ships. The tension on the bridge was palpable as Morrison led the charge, weaving through enemy fire with skill and precision. Every moment felt like a lifetime. Fire all weapons on my mark, Morrison ordered. "We take out their engines and disable their firing systems. We do this right, and Kepler 442b will be safe." "Understood, Captain," Brooks replied. As the Retribution neared the final bombardment ships, the enemy fired back with brutal force. The ship rocked as explosions hit its shields, but the human crew kept their focus. "Now," Morrison shouted. The Retribution unleashed a barrage of missiles and plasma fire, striking the bombardment ships with pinpoint accuracy. A few ships were destroyed in the initial blast, but the remaining ships still fired their devastating weapons toward the planet. The bombardment would not stop. "Take out their firing systems, now," Morrison ordered. "Targeting," Brooks called. "We've got them locked in, firing." In the final moments, the Retribution released a series of well-timed shots, hitting the key systems responsible for the bombardment. The hegemony ships staggered under the force of the attack, their weapons silenced. But just as victory seemed within reach, Morrison's eyes widened in horror. A final ship, the hegemony's flagship, was about to launch one last missile toward the planet. "Captain, incoming missile," Adams cried out. "Not on my watch," Morrison growled. "All ships evasive maneuvers, full power to engines now." The Retribution dodged with remarkable agility, but the enemy missile was already locked onto its course. It hurtled toward Kepler 442b's surface, aiming to strike the last of the Vidian cities. As it closed in on its target, Morrison watched helplessly, knowing that no maneuver could avoid it in time. In those final seconds, a voice came through on the radio. It was Rodriguez. "We've got the secondary bombardment site under control. We're moving to finish this. Captain, hold on." Would the missile strike the city before humanity could stop it? Could the humans, demons in the eyes of the Vidians, be the ones to save the day once again? Time seemed to stretch on the bridge of the Retribution as the missile from the hegemony flagship streaked toward Kepler 442b. The crew watched in a tense silence, the seconds ticking by like hours. Captain Jake Morrison stood frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no time to react. No time for anything except the cold, brutal realization that the battle was far from over. "Missile in range," Lieutenant Adams shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "Impact in 15 seconds. "Brooks, can we get a shot off?" Morrison barked, his voice clipped and harsh. The tactical officer shook his head. "We're too far away, Captain. The missile's trajectory is locked on the planet's surface. Even if we fire now, it won't make it in time." Morrison's grip tightened on the edge of his command chair. There had to be another way. He wouldn't let this world fall, not after everything the humans had sacrificed to get here. "Captain," Adams exclaimed. "The ground forces, Colonel Rodriguez's team is right in the strike zone. They're in the city. If this missile hits, they'll—" "Got him it," Morrison cursed, slamming his fist against the console. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a solution. The Retribution had taken on enemies that were far larger and more powerful, but this was different. The missile wasn't just a weapon. It was the final blow, the end of everything. The ground battle. Below on Kepler 442b, Lieutenant Colonel Amy Rodriguez's squad was still fighting through the burning ruins of the Vidian capital city. They had secured hundreds of civilians and taken out key hegemony forces, but the last remnants of the enemy's ground force were digging in, preparing to launch a final counterattack. The Marines were ready. They had no choice but to press forward. Rodriguez moved swiftly through the city's crumbling streets, her armor clanking with each step as she signaled her team to advance. "Watch your corners, Marines. Don't give them an inch." Her squad fanned out, weapons raised, eyes scanning for enemy movement. The buildings around them had once been beautiful crystalline structures, but now they were reduced to jagged skeletons. Every step forward felt like an eternity. The ground was uneven, the atmosphere thick with smoke and dust. The distant sound of explosions and gunfire filled the air, but Rodriguez's focus never wavered. The civilians needed to be evacuated. The hegemony had to be stopped. "Colonel," shouted Major Rick Davis over the radio, "we've got movement ahead. The enemy's setting up something big. We can't let them get a foothold." Rodriguez swore under her breath. "Do we have a location on that weapon?" "Negative, but we're heading in to flush them out." "Hold your fire until we have eyes on it," Rodriguez ordered. "We need this clean. The Vidians can't take any more collateral damage." As the team advanced, the city felt increasingly hostile. The hegemony forces, now scattered and desperate, were putting up a fierce resistance. The Marines moved methodically, clearing each block, each street. Rodriguez's thoughts raced. Every decision, every move they made had to count. And then, a sudden burst of static crackled through her comms. "Colonel, it's bad," Lieutenant Davis said, his voice strained. "We've got incoming fire, heavy artillery. We need to move now." Rodriguez looked up toward the horizon, her heart sinking in her chest. The sky was darkening with the shadow of an incoming missile. "Get them underground," she shouted to her squad. "Now move." But it was too late. A desperate measure. Above the planet, Morrison had no time left. His mind was a blur of tactical options, but nothing seemed to have a chance against the missile bearing down on the planet. He could hear the urgency in Adams' voice as she relayed information from the ground. "The missile is heading straight for the city center, Captain. It's aimed directly at Rodriguez's team." Morrison's heart froze. There was only one option left. "Set course for the missile," he ordered, his voice low and steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Full power to the engines, we're going in." "What?" Adams turned to face him, eyes wide in disbelief. "Captain, no, you can't." "I'm not leaving them behind," Morrison interrupted, his gaze hardening. "If we don't stop this missile, we lose everything. I'm not going to let that happen. We do this now or we lose the planet." Adams hesitated, but she knew Morrison well enough to understand the weight of his words. She didn't question his orders. She simply nodded and turned back to her console. "Captain will be in range in 30 seconds, Brooks reported. Morrison turned to face the rest of the crew. "We make this work, or we don't make it at all." The final gambit. On the surface, Rodriguez and her team were rushing toward cover as the missile's trajectory grew ever clearer. They were too close, too exposed, and the devastation was too much. She could hear the whine of the missile as it cut through the atmosphere. It was too close to stop. "We need to get underground, now," Rodriguez shouted, but the ground shook violently as a distant explosion rattled the earth beneath their feet. The sound of gunfire from the hegemony's final push intensified, but the Marines didn't flinch. They fought back. But as Rodriguez led her squad toward a building's basement, she knew there wasn't enough time to reach shelter. The missile was moments away from impact. In those final moments, as the missile descended toward Kepler 442b, the crew of the Retribution pushed every ounce of power into their engines. The ship rocketed toward the missile at impossible speeds. Morrison's knuckles were white as he gripped the controls. Every heartbeat felt like it could be the last. Then, with a deafening roar, the Retribution slammed into the path of the missile, the impact shattering the air. In that instant, time seemed to stand still. The Retribution collided with the missile in the vacuum of space, a thunderous explosion rocking the ship as the ship's shields flared brightly, absorbing the shock of the impact. For a moment, the entire crew held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. On the bridge, Captain Morrison's knuckles were white as he clutched the command chair, the ship vibrating from the force of the collision. The crew had only moments to act, but they were facing an enemy far more dangerous than any battle they had fought before. "Status," Morrison barked, his voice sharp and urgent. "We've intercepted the missile, Captain," Lieutenant Adams reported, her voice strained. "But the Retribution took some damage. Hull integrity at 50%. Shields are offline. We can't take another hit like that." Morrison's jaw clenched, but he didn't hesitate. They had stopped the missile from hitting Kepler 442b, but the battle wasn't over. "Brooks, what's our position on the remaining enemy ships?" The tactical officer's fingers danced across his console. "The last of their fleet is retreating, Captain. We've forced them into hyperspace. No pursuit is possible. The mission is complete." Morrison allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it was fleeting. The Retribution was badly damaged, and the battle on the surface was still raging. "Adams, signal Colonel Cross," he said. "Tell him the missile threat has been neutralized. We need extraction for the ground forces now." "Understood, Captain," Adams replied. Morrison took a deep breath and looked out the viewports at the wreckage of the hegemony's fleet drifting in space. For a moment, there was silence on the bridge, a moment of peace, however fleeting. On the surface, the price of victory. Down on Kepler 442b, the scene was one of chaos and destruction. The city that had once stood as a testament to the Vidian people's peaceful existence was now little more than smoldering ruins. The crystal towers, once majestic, were shattered and burned. The hegemony's bombardment had left deep scars across the planet's surface, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and burning debris. But amid the wreckage, there was hope. Lieutenant Colonel Amy Rodriguez and her team had made it to the shelter in time, taking cover in a fortified building as the missile exploded harmlessly in space. The city was still under fire, but the worst had passed. They had done it. Rodriguez stood at the front of her squad, her voice carrying over the noise of the battlefield. "We've done it, Marines. We stopped the missile, but we're not done yet. We still have work to do." "Yes, ma'am," Major Rick Davis said, his face covered in soot and sweat. "The hegemony's ground forces are scattering, but they're not gone yet." Rodriguez nodded. "Then we finish this. We don't leave any stragglers." The Marines moved quickly, clearing the remaining hegemony forces from the city. With each passing moment, the tide turned in their favor. The remaining enemy soldiers were disoriented, and the human Marines had become an unstoppable force, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Rodriguez's comms crackled to life again. "Rodriguez, this is Cross. You've done it. The hegemony fleet is gone, and the missile threat is neutralized. We've got ground support on the way. But there's more work to be done. We need to start evacuating the civilians." "Copy that, Colonel," Rodriguez said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her bones. "We'll move the civilians to the safe zones, make sure everyone gets out alive." Humanity's true face. In the aftermath of the battle, the humans and Vidians began the long and difficult process of rebuilding. The Retribution had provided support from above, and the ground forces had cleared the last of the hegemony's stragglers. But even as the fires of war began to die down, the cost was undeniable. Elder Zixth watched as the human soldiers worked side by side with the Vidians, clearing debris, tending to the wounded, and restoring the damaged infrastructure. She couldn't help but be amazed at the sight. These humans, whom her people had once feared as demons, were now the ones carrying the weight of salvation. As Zixth walked through the city, she encountered Colonel Cross, who was overseeing the construction of a new shelter for the survivors. His uniform was dirty, torn from the battle, but his eyes carried a tired, yet determined, glimmer. "You've done more than I could ever have hoped for," Zixth said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Cross, wiping the sweat from his brow, looked up at her. "We did what we had to do. You called for help. We answered." Zixth smiled faintly. "You were the demons we never knew we needed. But now I see the truth. You are not what we thought you were. You've shown us that sometimes even demons can be heroes." Cross nodded, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "We don't like to fight, but when the stakes are high, we'll do whatever it takes to protect the innocent. That's what makes us human." The galaxy knows. As the sun began to set on Kepler 442b, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Zixth stood on a rise overlooking the rebuilding city. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets as the survivors, both human and Vidian, worked together to create something new from the ruins of war. Zixth knew that their people had been forever changed. The Vidians had been shown a new way of survival, one that didn't rely on the peace they had known for millennia. They had learned that sometimes, in order to protect what was precious, one had to fight, even if it meant becoming something they had never thought they would be. And in the stars, the message of humanity's victory spread far and wide. The galaxy would never forget how Earth had sent its demons to save a peaceful world. The name of humanity would be spoken in every corner of the galaxy, and it would echo in the hearts of those who had once feared them. For the first time, the galaxy knew what it truly meant to be human, to fight for what is right, no matter the cost. Months passed since the battle for Kepler 442b, and the humans had kept their promise. The Vidians were rebuilding their world, and Earth had left a lasting presence to ensure their safety. The Vidians had learned much from their human allies, from strategies of defense to the importance of trust between species. Zix stood at the edge of the crystal tower, watching as a new day began to break over the horizon. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above. There were still challenges ahead, but Kepler 442b was no longer a dying world. It was a world reborn, because humanity had chosen to stand beside them. And as the wind whispered through the crystal fields, Zix knew that the universe had been irrevocably changed. The galaxy had learned one important truth. When evil threatens the innocent, there will always be those who rise to fight. Sometimes those heroes will wear the face of demons, But no matter their form, they will be the ones to save the day.